Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Before I get started, I want to thank Rosa, Lucas, Rick, everybody from Sonic Acts. I also want to thank the people who have inspired this panel, this talk, some of which are here, some of which are speaking as a part of it, and some of which are not. But you'll see some references kind of in the captions. So the subtitle to this panel is the metaphysics of change, and the reason why I'm pairing this with the term tipping points is because I wanna bring light to the idea that our understanding of the concept of change is a contingent epistemological and historiographic concept. It is something which in current times has become represented and symbolized by various geometric figures, which I will go into. But the point of this panel is to understand, or is to open up our understanding for how we can sense and perceive and register change in our environment, in ourselves, etc. So the starting point for this talk is actually not with change itself, but it comes from the idea of the singularity. Now, Kazis Varnelis in an issue of Volume talks about the question of the singularity, or this idea not as a technological concept but as a astrophysical concept. And he makes a somewhat almost commonsensical observation that, you know, if we were to actually approach the singularity if we had already entered a black hole and we're approaching this, time and space, but more importantly, time would distort around us. So due to this temporal distortion, it's actually impossible to know whether we are at the singularity or whether we've passed it or if we're still approaching it, because we do not know how to perceive time and space when we are already, you know, in the black hole. So drawing from this observation, I started to ask the question, why does the apocalypse have the image of an instant? So now the apocalypse comes from an ancient Greek word which means an uncovering. And in a classical understanding, it means the disclosure of knowledge or a revelation. It's often associated with symbolism, and as I'll mention a little bit, it was talked about in the last book of the New Testament. But the way that the apocalypse has been, let's say, represented in contemporary cultural production is something a bit more like this. This is the infamous Day After Tomorrow film. And you know, symbolism has always been quite important to our understanding of the apocalypse as some sort of an event, but the end of the worldness is a rather peculiar phenomena that we do not see, at least within the Christian tradition. Though we do have the four horsemen of the apocalypse, we do not see the destruction of the earth. So this is another representation of the Book of Revelation. But so in trying to answer this question of why does the apocalypse have the image of an instant, I came to, you know, a more recent example of the Mesoamerican long count calendar. Now, something happened, as we're probably well familiar, which maybe gave me a grounding for why we may think of it as, you know, a specific moment, an instant, something that could be captured in a single image. On December 20th, 2012, on the Gregorian calendar at least, the 12th Baktun concluded, and on the 21st, a new one started. So Baktuns are the long count calendar cycles of ages. The last one, it's a cycle of 144,000 days. The last one was on September 18th, 1618. So this one is kind of oddly significant because the way the long count calendar works is by identifying a mythical creation date and counting the numbers past. So the mythical creation date that was selected for the Mesoamerican long count calendar throughout different cultures, not just Mayan, is August 11th, 3114 BCE. And this is also identified as the 13th Baktun. So there's a similitude between, at least conjecturally speaking, between this 13th Baktun of the originary creation date, after which time restarted. It went, the number reset from 13 down to 1. Now, that said, our current Piktun, which is kind of the higher order within which our time is inscribed, supposedly holds 19 Baktuns, so this may not be really a problem for us yet, but who knows. But so I still wanted to ask this question, understanding this idea of the apocalypse, not just as a revelation, but also as potentially a process. What if it actually did start in 2012? So moving from this idea of an instant, I started to think about how we understand change over time. So the first most emblematic reference point that I have is this graph from 1956, the first peak oil graph, which is actually something that I've talked to a lot of people about, and people younger than me don't even know what peak oil is. And I think that there's a reason for this, but I want to kind of look into this geometric form as a representation of some sort of coming apocalypse a bit more. Now, the form that you're looking at here is a bell curve, or which comes from Laplace's principle of errors. But what's weird here is that it's the application of a statistical understanding of the population to the temporal dimension. And this bell curve, this geometric figure, is not some sort of abstract or academic figure. It's come to hold great social effect. I mean, much more maybe than peak oil has. So the Belgian astronomer Adolphe Quetelet took the figure of this to create a social ideology based around the average man, and towards these ends, he invented, with this idea of the normal distribution of society, he invented what we now know as the body mass index. But conversely, so instead of the average man, Sir Francis Galton, who's actually the half-cousin of Charles Darwin, invented the intelligent quotient, using this exact same figure, but interpreted it as something that is manipulable, that the curve is not always in the middle, that it can also be moved forward and back. So with the intelligent quotient, there is this idea that we should aim towards the ideal and not towards the average. So these geometric figures that we're looking at are in a sense normativizing and devices. They're techniques. But so, looking at the ways that this was applied within early statistics of social demography, both Quetelet and Galton's main thesis argues that the history of evolution is aimed at a fixed point in development. Now, they understood themselves that they could not calculate the average of the entire human species, so they broke things down in the typological fashion of the time into eugenical and racial categories. But bringing this figure back to peak oil, it similarly presumes an understanding and a knowledge of the whole. The caption here is really the key point. The ultimate world crude oil production based on initial reserves of 1,250 billion barrels. But we do not know how much oil this world contains. I mean, just right after Trump was elected, what is quoted to be the possibly the largest ever crude oil deposit in the U.S. was discovered. So, I mean, weirdly enough, at around the same time, this was 1956, another figure emerged, another geometric figure by Roger Revelle and Hans Suess, which is the measurement of carbon dioxide. And I want to look at the difference between these two figures. These two graphs are fundamentally related, but the geometry, the geometric logic and principles behind them are radically different. So I thought that it could be productive to maybe look at these figures, to try and understand these figures through different lenses to see which, maybe we're actually not looking at different things. We're just looking at the same thing in a different way. Now, yes, there are measurements, but I think according to mathematics, this has different variables or different meanings. So I started looking at the way functions are distributed or read. The first function is just fx equals fx. It's that the function describes change. But then what we have is the derivative, which describes the rate of change. And then lastly, we have the integral, which describes the total displacement as a result of change. So what we can see by superimposing a regular function over an integral function is how the two correlate with each other, that one is the sum of the other. And weirdly enough, just by superimposing the graphs of an integral and a regular function of a bell curve, it strangely approximates what happens if you overlay the CO2 graph over the bell curve of peak oil. But instead of focusing on this, I want to focus more on the reading of the derivative. And now I understand that the derivative has been talked about quite a lot within critical philosophy, dealing with its incorporation into finance. But looking at it from a mathematical and almost algebraic, a geometric principle, we can start to look at the difference between the function. Now there are 3 points here noted, and each of them are in a certain way tipping points. They're where something that was going up starts going down. But in the regular function, what we see at the top, at the peak of the bell curve, is what we call a critical point. Now we're quite used to thinking critically, and it's maybe these points where we think that things are going to turn down that we look for. But what I want to try and to lay out is what happens, or how do we begin to look for inflection points, these derivative peaks that do not necessarily represent they do not represent themselves on the main function, but they do signify, let's say, an overall trajectory. So the derivative, what it is in very basic calculus terms, it measures the sensitivity to change of one variable that is determined by another. So what I want to do is to maybe shift our understanding from critical thinking towards inflective sensibility. And I think both of the speakers that will be speaking after me will address this. But so in conclusion, I want to end with Zeno's paradox as a way to make the case for maybe why we need to look beyond critical points. Zeno's paradox says, if it's taking the example of Homer. Suppose Homer wishes to walk to the end of a path. Before he can get there, he must get halfway there. Before he can get halfway there, he must get a quarter of the way there. Before traveling a quarter, he must travel 1/8. Before an eighth, 1/16, and so on. So at the same time, what this paradox says is that you either never leave or you never end. You can never actually reach your destination. But so this is a paradox because it requires you to kind of look outside the conditions and the bounds of the problem itself. So the solution is that Homer will never reach the end because the end never stays fixed. So really what the end is in this diagram is not the one, it's actually the red line that cuts through the equal sign. So we can also look at this, in kind of normal physics. Trajectories don't, they stop because they stop because they are stopped. And similarly, even if we think it's the ground, it's only because we can't see the projective tendency that the projectiles that we throw into space have. What I'm trying to do by bringing together this panel is to fertilize the ground for what I'm calling an anti-eschatological politics. And And I hope that we can understand what that means through the work of the next two people. So I'll introduce both. The first presentation will be by John Massino. John is an architect and urbanist. He established Territorial Agency together with Anne-Sophie Ronskog. And Territorial Agency is an independent organization that innovatively promotes and works for sustainable territorial transformations. Territorial Agency works to strengthen the capacity of local and international communities in comprehensive spatial transformation management. Territorial Agency's projects channel available spatial resources towards the development of their full potential. So John will be speaking about the complicated relationship between seeing and truth through projects on the Anthropocene and oil. And then followed by that will be Natasha Ginwala. Natasha Ginwala is a curator, researcher, and writer. She's curator of the Contour Biennial 8 and curatorial advisor for Documenta 14. Some recent projects include My East is Your West, featuring Shilpa Gupta and Rashid Rana at the 56th Venice Biennale, Still Against the Sky at Cave Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, and Corruption Everybody Knows with Eflux New York within the framework of Super Community. And Natasha will be reflecting on the ways in which artistic acts of testimony, evidence, and witnessing expose and challenge the limits of justice. Thank you.